Tonight we descend into the dark waters of the Great Lakes, where fog rolls across endless black surfaces, and the echoes of ancient drums still vibrate through the mist. These five massive freshwater seas hold terrifying legends passed down through centuries by native tribes who knew their power, their fury, and the creatures that lurked beneath. Journey with me through Ojibwe, Iroquois, and Algonquin, tales of water monsters, vengeful spirits, and beings that still prowl these depths. Discover why tribes performed sacred rituals before crossing these waters, and what they believed waited in the darkness below. Before we begin, settle in. Whether you are watching from the shores of these very lakes, from distant lands across oceans, or from somewhere in between, this journey will carry you into waters both real and mythical. The stories you are about to hear were spoken in whispers around fires, passed from elder to child, and carved into the collective memory of peoples who lived alongside these inland seas for thousands of years. The Great Lakes are not ordinary bodies of water. They contain 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. They stretch across nearly 95,000 square miles. Their depths plunge to over 1,000 feet in places, deeper than many ocean trenches. They generate their own weather systems, create waves that rival ocean swells, and have claimed more ships and lives than the infamous Bermuda Triangle. To the native peoples who lived along their shores, fished their waters, and traveled their surfaces in birch bark canoes, these were not simply lakes. They were living entities, possessed of spirits, guarded by monsters, and governed by forces that demanded respect, fear, and constant vigilance. Let us begin where the legends run deepest, in the cold, dark waters of Lake Superior. Lake Superior stretches before us like an inland ocean, its waters so cold that bodies never surface, preserved in the depths for eternity. The Ojibwe people who lived along its shores knew this lake as Gichigami, the Great Water, and they knew it was home to one of the most feared beings in all native mythology, Mishapez the water panther, the great lynx, the creature whose very name caused warriors to lower their voices and children to stay far from the shoreline after dark. Imagine, if you can, a creature unlike anything that walks the earth. Picture the muscular body of a mountain lion, powerful and sleek, but covered not in fur, but in scales that gleam like burnished copper in the sunlight. From its head sprout antlers, massive and branching like those of the greatest stag, but darker, twisted, emanating an otherworldly menace. Its tail is not the tail of any cat, but a serpent's tail, long and thick, covered in those same metallic scales, capable of wrapping around a canoe and pulling it beneath the surface in seconds. Its eyes glow with an intelligence that is not animal, not human, but something ancient and malevolent. The Ojibwe elders spoke of Mishepezeu with a mixture of reverence and terror. This was not a simple monster to be avoided or fought. This was a spirit being, a guardian of the underwater realm, a force of nature given form and consciousness. It dwelled in the deepest parts of the lake, in underwater caves where copper veins ran through the rock. For Mishapezo was associated with this sacred metal, and some said the creature itself was formed from living copper, given life by forces older than memory. When Mishepeze moved through the water, the surface above would suddenly churn and boil without warning. Whirlpools would form in calm water, spinning with such violence that anything caught in their grip would be pulled down into the darkness where the water panther waited. Fishermen learned to recognize the signs. A sudden temperature drop in the air, an unnatural stillness across the water, the appearance of strange ripples moving against the wind. These were warnings that Mishepezeo was near, that the creature was hunting, and that anyone on the water was in mortal danger. But the most terrifying aspect of Mishepezeo was not its physical form or its power. It was the creature's method of claiming victims. The Ojibwe believed that if you saw the reflection of Mishapezheu in the water, if you glimpsed even a portion of its form mirrored on the surface, you were marked for death. The creature would follow you. It would wait. And when you next ventured onto the lake, it would rise from below and capsize your vessel, dragging you down to its underwater lair. Some who were taken by Mishapezheu, the stories say, were not killed, they were transformed. Pulled into the creature's realm, they became servants of the water panther, half human and half spirit, dwelling forever in the cold depths, occasionally surfacing to lure others to the same fate. On foggy mornings, voices would sometimes call from the mist, the voices of those who had disappeared, pleading for help, begging loved ones to come into the water. But the wise knew these were the transformed ones, the servants of Mishipedzeu, and to answer their calls was to join them in their eternal servitude. The Ojibwe developed elaborate protections against the water panther. Before any journey across Lake Superior, offerings had to be made. Tobacco was the most common, thrown into the water with prayers asking safe passage. Red cloth was considered powerful, tied to the bow of a canoe or worn by the travelers. Most importantly, canoes were painted with protective symbols, thunderbirds primarily, for the thunderbird was the great enemy of the water panthers, the sky spirit that hunted these underwater demons. You see, in Ojibwe cosmology, the universe was divided into three realms. The sky realm, ruled by the thunderbirds, great eagle-like beings that controlled storms and lightning. The earth realm, where humans and animals dwelled. And the underwater realm, the domain of Mishipedzeu and other water spirits. These realms were in constant tension, constant battle. The thunderbirds would dive into the lakes to hunt water panthers, their clashes creating terrible storms. Lightning was the weapon of the thunderbirds, striking down at the underwater spirits. Thunder was the sound of their great wings beating, and rain was the water thrown up by the thrashing of Mishipedzeu as it fought against its aerial attackers. When a particularly violent storm arose over Lake Superior, the Ojibwe understood what was happening. Somewhere beneath those churning waves, a battle was taking place between the forces of the upper and lower worlds. And any human caught on the water was simply collateral damage in a war that had raged since the beginning of time. Rock paintings along the shores of Lake Superior, some of them hundreds of years old, show the form of Mishipedzeu. These pictographs were not mere art. They were warnings, boundary markers, indications that a particular stretch of water was especially dangerous, that the water panther was known to hunt there. Some of these paintings were also offerings in themselves, created by medicine men to appease the creature, to acknowledge its power, to ask for mercy. Even today, even now in our modern age of science and reason, strange things happen on Lake Superior. Ships vanish in calm water, experienced swimmers disappear without a trace. Fishermen report seeing shapes moving beneath their boats, shapes too large to be any known fish, shapes that seem to be watching them. Sonar readings pick up massive objects in the deep that move with purpose and then vanish. And on foggy nights, there are still those who swear they hear voices calling from the water, voices that speak their names, voices that promise warmth and safety if they will just come into the lake. The Ojibwe would tell you these are not mysteries. They would tell you that Mishipedzeu still hunts the depths of Lake Superior, still claims those who disrespect the water, still drags the foolish and the unlucky down to the cold darkness where the sun never reaches. But Lake Superior is not the only great lake with its monsters and spirits. Let us travel now to Lake Michigan, the lake of the sleeping giant, where the dunes themselves are said to contain a spirit so powerful that entire tribes would not speak its name after the sun went down. Lake Michigan stretches along the western shore of what is now Michigan and Wisconsin, its waters deep blue and deceptively calm on summer days. But the tribes who lived here, the Potawatomi, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, they knew better. They knew that beneath the surface, in the trenches and valleys of the lake floor, ancient beings slumbered, and to wake them was to invite catastrophe. The legends speak of a great spirit that fell from the sky in ages past, a being of immense power that crashed into the earth with such force that it created the very basin that would become Lake Michigan. This spirit, wounded and furious, sank beneath the waters and entered a deep sleep, a hibernation that has lasted for thousands of years. But it is not dead, it merely sleeps. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when humans grow too arrogant or too careless with the lake, the sleeping giant stirs. When this happens, the signs are unmistakable. The water takes on a strange color, a deep greenish-black that is not natural. Fish behave erratically, swimming in frenzied circles or beaching themselves on the shore. Birds refuse to fly over certain areas of the lake, circling around invisible boundaries. And a sound can be heard, a low rumbling that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. The tribes understood that these were warnings. The sleeping giant was turning in its slumber, disturbed by something, and if the disturbance continued, if whatever had irritated the spirit was not corrected, the giant would wake fully. And on the rare occasions when that happened, when the sleeping giant of Lake Michigan truly roused itself, the results were cataclysmic. Entire villages would be swallowed by waves that came from nowhere, walls of water that rose up under clear skies and swept away everything in their path. The earth itself would shake, tremors radiating out from the center of the lake, and at the heart of it all, witnesses reported seeing something vast break the surface, a form so large that it defied comprehension, covered in what looked like stone or hardened earth, moving with ponderous, terrible purpose before sinking again into the depths. The native peoples developed strict protocols for Lake Michigan. Offerings were required before any fishing expedition, any crossing, any time the water was used. But these were not simple offerings like those given to other spirits. The sleeping giant required tobacco, yes, but also copper objects, carefully crafted items that were thrown into the deepest parts of the lake. Some tribes would perform elaborate ceremonies before the ice melted each spring, rituals designed to soothe the sleeping giant, to assure it that humans still respected its domain, that they had not forgotten what dwelled below. There were also places along Lake Michigan that were absolutely forbidden. Certain islands, certain stretches of shoreline, certain points where the water suddenly dropped to immense depths. These were places where the sleeping giant was closest to the surface, where the barrier between its slumbering consciousness and the waking world was thin. To camp on these shores, to fish in these waters, to even paddle a canoe too close, this was considered a form of suicide. The elders would tell stories of entire hunting parties that ignored these warnings, that scoffed at the old tales, and were never seen again. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the sleeping giant legend is the prophecy that accompanies it. The elders spoke of a time that would come, a future age, when humans would grow so numerous and so arrogant that they would build great cities on the shores of Lake Michigan, would fill the lake with their boats and their refuse, would treat the water as if it were theirs to command. And in that age, the sleeping giant would finally wake, not partially, not briefly, but fully and permanently. And when that happened, the giant would rise from the depths and reclaim what had always been its domain, sweeping away the cities, the people, everything humans had built, returning the shores to wilderness and silence. Some would say this is merely legend, merely the primitive fears of ancient peoples. But those who study the Great Lakes, who understand their power and their danger, are not so quick to dismiss these tales. Lake Michigan has the second largest volume of water among the Great Lakes. Its depths reach over 900 feet in places. It generates lake-effect snow that can bury entire towns. Its currents are treacherous, capable of pulling even strong swimmers out to their deaths. Its temperature gradients create sudden, violent storms that appear with almost no warning. And there are the disappearances. Every year, people vanish on Lake Michigan. Experienced sailors whose boats are found empty and adrift. Swimmers who are there one moment and gone the next, their bodies never recovered. Small aircraft that go down over the lake and are never found despite extensive searches. The statistics are sobering. More than 6,000 ships have been lost on the Great Lakes, and a significant portion of those were on Lake Michigan. The native peoples would tell you they know why. They would tell you that the sleeping giant is restless, that its slumber is no longer as deep as it once was, that each disappearance, each inexplicable tragedy, is evidence of the spirit turning, moving, reaching out from its dreams to touch the waking world. And they would tell you to be careful, to make your offerings, to speak respectfully of the lake, to remember that you are a visitor in a domain that belongs to something far older and far more powerful than humankind. Now let us turn our attention to the shallowest and most temperamental of the Great Lakes. Let us speak of Lake Erie and the storm demons that plague its waters. Lake Erie is different from its sister lakes in crucial ways. It is the shallowest, with an average depth of only 62 feet. It is the warmest, its waters heating quickly in summer, and it is, according to both native legend and modern meteorological data, the most prone to sudden, violent, deadly storms. The tribes who lived along its shores, primarily the Iroquois and the Erie people for whom the lake is named, understood that this lake was the domain of weather spirits, entities that took a particular delight in tormenting humans. The storm demons of Lake Erie were believed to be the spirits of warriors who died violent deaths on the water. In battle, in storms, drowning while their enemies looked on, these warriors did not pass peacefully into the afterlife. Their rage and their pain anchored them to the lake, transformed them into something no longer human, entities made of wind and water and fury. These storm demons dwelled just beneath the surface, waiting for boats to venture out, and when they sensed prey, they would rise. The first sign of a storm demon attack was the sudden calm. If you were on Lake Erie and the wind that had been blowing steadily suddenly died, if the waves that had been lapping at your canoe abruptly flattened into an unnatural stillness, you had perhaps minutes to reach shore. Because the calm was not peace, it was the storm demons gathering themselves, drawing power from the air and water, preparing to strike. What followed was unlike any natural storm. The wind would come from multiple directions at once, creating chaotic, impossible wave patterns. The water would seem to rise in columns, spouts that danced across the surface with deliberate malice, chasing boats, herding them toward deeper water. And in the howl of the wind, you could hear them. Voices, screaming, laughing, calling out in languages both familiar and alien. The storm demons were not silent killers. They wanted you to know they were there. They wanted you to feel the same terror they had felt as they drowned. Those who survived encounters with the storm demons spoke of seeing faces in the water, distorted and furious, rising up in the waves before crashing down. Some reported that the demons would take solid form for brief moments, appearing as twisted human figures made of water and foam, reaching for the boat with hands that seemed almost substantial before dissolving back into the lake. And there were those who swore the demons could capsize a canoe without even manifesting, that you would suddenly find yourself in the water with no understanding of how you got there, and then the hands would find you, pulling you down, holding you under, and the last thing you would see before drowning would be the faces of those who died before you, welcoming you to their ranks. The Iroquois developed specific rituals to protect against storm demons. Before any journey on Lake Erie, warriors would cut their hair and burn it as an offering, along with tobacco and dried corn. The burning hair represented a sacrifice of the self, an acknowledgement that humans were vulnerable, that the spirits had power over life and death. Canoes were painted with spirals and wave patterns, symbols meant to confuse the demons, to make the boat appear as part of the water itself, rather than an intruder upon it. But the most important protection was simply respect. The storm demons, the legends said, attacked primarily those who showed arrogance on the water. If you boasted of your paddling skill, if you ignored warnings about weather, if you took the lake for granted, the demons would hear, and they would come for you. Humility was armor, fear was wisdom, and silence was survival. There were also places on Lake Erie that the storm demons favored, areas where they concentrated and where attacks were most frequent. The islands, particularly Pele Island and the Bass Islands, were considered especially dangerous. Currents around these islands created natural whirlpools and eddies, and the demons used these features to their advantage, waiting in the spinning water for boats to drift too close. Even today, these areas are known for treacherous conditions and frequent boating accidents. One particular aspect of the storm demon legends is especially chilling. The tribes believed that these entities could possess people. If you survived an attack, if you somehow made it back to shore after an encounter with the demons, you might bring something back with you. A darkness would settle over survivors, a melancholy and rage that had not been there before. They would become obsessed with the lake, would stand on the shore for hours staring at the water, would talk in their sleep in voices that were not their own. Some would walk back into the lake in the middle of the night, waiting out until the water closed over their heads, compelled by the demons that had marked them. Medicine men would perform cleansing ceremonies for survivors, burning sage and cedar, painting protective symbols on their bodies, chanting for days to drive out the influence of the storm demons. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the survivor would recover, the darkness would lift, and they would return to their normal life, though they would never set foot on Lake Erie again. But sometimes the cleansing failed. Sometimes the demon's hold was too strong. And then the tribe would have to make a terrible decision, because an individual possessed by a storm demon was a danger to everyone around them, a conduit through which the demon could reach onto land and claim more victims. Modern sailors and fishermen on Lake Erie, even those who know nothing of native legends, will tell you the lake has moods. They will tell you it can turn from calm to deadly in minutes. They will describe waves that seem to target their boats, winds that shift in ways that make no meteorological sense. They will admit, often reluctantly, that they have heard voices in storms on Lake Erie, that they have seen shapes in the water that cannot be explained, that they sometimes feel watched when they are out on the lake alone. The native peoples would nod at these accounts. They would say that the storm demons are still there, still angry, still hunting. The lake has not changed, they would say. Only the people have changed. Modern humans have forgotten the old ways, forgotten to make offerings, forgotten to show respect. And the demons, patient and eternal, are simply waiting for these new intruders to make a mistake. Let us move now to Lake Ontario, smallest of the Great Lakes by surface area, but deep and cold, and home to perhaps the strangest legend of all. Let us speak of Gasiandietha, the meteor dragon. The Iroquois people who dominated the lands around Lake Ontario told of a creature that was not born of earth or water, but that fell from the sky in a night of fire and terror. Gasiandietha was a serpent wreathed in flames, a dragon whose body glowed with intense heat, whose passage through the air left trails of smoke and embers. According to the ancient stories, this being descended from the heavens during a night when the stars fell, a meteor shower that the Iroquois witnessed with awe and fear. But one of the falling stars did not simply burn up in the atmosphere. One of them was alive. Gasiandietha crashed into Lake Ontario with an impact that created steam clouds visible for miles. The water around the impact site boiled for days. Fish floated dead to the surface by the thousands. And when the lake finally calmed, when the steam dissipated and the water cooled, the tribes discovered that something had survived. Something now lived in the depths of Lake Ontario, a creature of fire somehow sustaining itself in cold water, a being of cosmic origin that had no place in the natural order of the earth. The descriptions of Gasiandietha vary slightly between different Iroquois nations, but the core details remain consistent. The creature is serpentine, long and sinuous like a snake, but impossibly large, some accounts suggesting it is as long as several canoes placed end to end. Its scales are metallic, resembling copper or brass, and they glow with an internal light, a reddish-orange luminescence that makes the creature visible even in the deepest water. Spines, or fins, run along its back, and these too emit light, creating the appearance of flames dancing along the creature's length. Its head is dragon-like, with large eyes that burn with literal fire, and a mouth full of fangs that drip with molten venom. But the most bizarre aspect of Gasiandietha is its relationship with fire and water. The creature can, according to legend, superheat the water around it at will. When it hunts, it rises from the depths, and the lake surface above it begins to steam and bubble. Any fish in the vicinity are instantly cooked alive. Any boat unfortunate enough to be directly above the rising dragon would find the water around it boiling, the hull of the canoe growing too hot to touch, and if the occupants did not paddle away fast enough, the heat would become unbearable, forcing them into the water where the scalding temperature would kill them quickly. Gasiandietha could also, the stories say, leave the water. On certain nights, the meteor dragon would rise from Lake Ontario and fly, trailing flames behind it, soaring over the forests and hills of the region. Those who saw it described a comet-like appearance, a fiery streak across the night sky that moved with serpentine grace. But this was no mindless beast. Gasiandietha was intelligent, malicious, and it took particular pleasure in terrorizing humans. The dragon would dive at villages, not landing, but passing overhead low enough that its heat would set fire to roofs and trees. It would circle back and forth, its roar shaking the earth, until the entire settlement was in flames. Then it would return to the lake, plunging into the cold water with a hiss of steam, satisfied with the destruction it had caused. The Iroquois developed defenses against the meteor dragon, though these were as much about appeasing the creature as repelling it. Large fires were built on the shores of Lake Ontario during certain times of the year, offerings of flame to the flame dragon, acknowledgments of its power. Warriors would throw copper ornaments and tools into the lake, gifts to Gacy bribes to keep it in the depths and away from the villages. But the most important protection was the thunderbird. Remember, in the cosmology of the Great Lakes tribes, thunderbirds were the great enemies of water monsters. And while Gasyanditha was not precisely a water monster, having come from the sky, it had made its home in the underwater realm, and thus it fell under the dominion that the thunderbirds patrolled. The legends tell of epic battles between thunderbirds and the meteor dragon. The sky spirits would hunt Gasyanditha, diving at the lake with talons extended and lightning crackling around them. When they struck the water near the dragon, the resulting explosion of steam would create fog banks that covered the entire lake for days. Sometimes the thunderbirds would succeed in driving Gasyanditha deep into the lake, forcing it to retreat to underwater caves where it would remain for years. But the dragon was never killed, never truly defeated, and eventually it would recover its strength and rise again to torment the surface world. The Iroquois believed that the meteor dragon poisoned the waters of Lake Ontario. The creature's presence, they said, corrupted the lake, made it dangerous in ways beyond the obvious physical threat. Fish caught from certain areas of Lake Ontario would make people sick. Water drawn from the lake in places where Gasyanditha was known to dwell would cause rashes and illness. Some areas of the lake shore were considered permanently tainted, places where the dragon's poison had seeped into the earth itself, and to camp there or drink from streams that fed into those areas was to risk slow death. There are some who connect the legend of Gasyanditha to the real meteor impacts that have occurred around the Great Lakes region. The Holliford crater in Ontario, though on land rather than in the lake, is evidence that significant meteor strikes have happened in this area. Could ancient peoples have witnessed such an impact? Could the legend of the meteor dragon be a cultural memory of a real celestial event, filtered through generations of storytelling until the meteor became a living creature? Whether or not Gasyanditha ever truly existed, whether it was a misidentified natural phenomenon or pure mythology, the impact of the legend on the peoples around Lake Ontario was real and profound. Entire stretches of shoreline were avoided. Fishing was conducted with elaborate precautions, and the night sky was watched carefully for any sign of the dragon taking flight. Even today, Lake Ontario produces strange phenomena. There are areas where the water temperature spikes inexplicably, rising many degrees above the surrounding lake for no apparent reason. Lights have been reported moving beneath the surface, luminescent shapes that do not correspond to any known marine life or human activity. And there are the fog banks, dense and impenetrable, that sometimes form over Lake Ontario with startling speed, rolling across the water like living things, carrying with them an acrid smell that stings the eyes and throat. The Iroquois would tell you these are signs of Gasyanditha. They would tell you the meteor dragon still dwells in the depths of Lake Ontario, sleeping perhaps, but not gone, never gone. And they would advise you to show respect, to remember that this lake holds a creature that fell from the stars, a being that belongs to neither earth nor sky nor water, but exists in a category of its own, alien and eternal and utterly beyond human understanding. We must turn now to Lake Huron, second largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, known to the Ojibwe and Ottawa peoples as a lake of spirits and sorrow. The legends here are different in character from the others we have explored. Here, the horror is not of creatures attacking, but of voices calling, of the dead reaching out to the living, of the lake itself serving as a gateway between worlds. Lake Huron's shores are dotted with islands. Manitoulin Island, the largest freshwater island in the world, lies in its northern reaches. Smaller islands, hundreds of them, scatter across the lake like seeds, and it is these islands, particularly the smaller uninhabited ones, that feature prominently in the darkest legends of Lake Huron. The tribes spoke of singing stones, rocks along certain shorelines and on certain islands that produce sounds without any apparent cause. These were not the normal sounds of wind over stone or water erosion. These were musical tones, rising and falling in patterns that resembled songs, sometimes even resembling human voices singing in unison. The phenomenon occurred most often at dawn and dusk, during those liminal times when the barrier between the physical and spirit worlds was thinnest. The native peoples understood these singing stones to be the voices of the drowned. Lake Huron, like all the Great Lakes, had claimed many lives over the centuries. Warriors lost in storms, children who wandered too far from shore, hunters whose canoes capsized in rough water. All of these dead were said to remain in the lake, their spirits unable or unwilling to move on to the afterlife. And the singing stones were their attempt to communicate with the living world, to call out, to make their presence known. But these were not benign spirits seeking comfort or rescue. These were bitter, angry, dead, resentful of the living, who still enjoyed sunlight and warmth and breath. The songs they sang were lures, designed to draw the curious closer to the water's edge, to pull them in. Those who listened to the singing stones too long would fall into a trance, mesmerized by the haunting melodies. They would walk into the water fully clothed, wading deeper and deeper until the lake closed over their heads. And then they would join the chorus, their voice added to the singing stones, calling out to the next victim. Medicine men warned the people to avoid the islands where the singing was loudest. They taught that if you heard the singing, you must turn away immediately, cover your ears, and leave the area as quickly as possible. Under no circumstances should you try to identify the voices or listen for words in the melody, because once the spirits knew you were listening, once they established that connection, they would follow you. The singing would start to haunt your dreams. You would hear it when no one else could, a constant whisper in the back of your mind, slowly driving you mad, slowly pulling you back toward the lake. There were also the Forbidden Islands themselves, places where the tragedy had been so great, where so many had died, that the entire landmass became saturated with death energy. The Ottawa people spoke of one island in particular, an island whose name they would not speak aloud, where an entire village had been caught by disease many generations ago. The survivors fled the island, leaving their dead unburied in their haste to escape the contagion. The bodies were never properly laid to rest, never given the ceremonies required to help spirits transition to the afterlife. As a result, that island became a place of concentrated spiritual torment. The dead remained there, confused and suffering, unable to leave, unable to rest. Any living person who set foot on the island would be overwhelmed by an oppressive sense of dread. They would hear whispers from empty lodges, see shadows moving between the trees where no physical form cast them. Some who landed on the island reported that time seemed to behave strangely, that hours would pass in what felt like minutes, or that the sun would remain frozen in the sky while they searched desperately for their canoe to escape. Worse still, those who spent a night on the Forbidden Island would bring something back with them, an attachment, a spirit that clung to them, that rode back with them to the mainland and infiltrated their home. Objects would move without being touched. Cold spots would appear in lodges during summer. Family members would fall ill with mysterious ailments. And eventually, the person who had set foot on the island would die, often in circumstances that mirrored the deaths of those who perished there long ago. The only way to survive such an attachment was immediate intervention by powerful medicine people. Sweat lodge ceremonies lasting days, immersion in sacred smoke, chanting and drumming without rest, these extreme measures might succeed in severing the connection to the island's dead. But even then, the person would never be the same. They would carry a shadow for the rest of their life, a darkness that others could sense, a mark that identified them as someone who had touched the spirit world and barely escaped. Lake Huron also features prominently in legends of prophetic dreams. The Ojibwe believed that sleeping too close to the shore of Lake Huron would induce visions, and not the pleasant or enlightening kind. These were nightmares with the weight of prophecy, dreams that showed drownings and disasters before they occurred. Medicine men seeking visions might deliberately camp near the lake, but ordinary people avoided sleeping within sight of the water, because the dreams Lake Huron sent were often unbearable. You might dream of your own death, see yourself struggling in dark water, feel the cold seeping into your limbs as you sink. You might dream of the deaths of loved ones, watching them vanish beneath waves while you stood helpless on the shore. Or you might dream of disasters yet to come, villages destroyed by storms, entire fleets of canoes capsized and lost. These dreams were so vivid, so emotionally devastating, that people woke from them screaming, and some never recovered their peace of mind, living the rest of their lives haunted by what they had seen in their sleep beside Lake Huron. The tribes developed rituals to cleanse themselves after such dreams. to break the prophetic connection before it could manifest in reality. But these rituals were not always successful. There are stories of dreamers who tried to warn others about disasters they had foreseen, only to be ignored, and then watching in horror as their nightmares came true exactly as they had dreamed them. Modern visitors to Lake Huron's islands sometimes report experiences that echo these old legends. Campers speak of hearing voices and music when they are alone on remote islands, sounds that have no identifiable source. Hikers find themselves overcome with sudden, inexplicable fear in certain locations, fleeing without understanding why. And there are the suicides, the people who walk into Lake Huron fully clothed and aware, sometimes leaving notes that speak of voices calling them, of a compulsion they could not resist. The native peoples would recognize these patterns. They would see the continuation of the old tragedies, the persistence of the hungry dead. Lake Huron, they would tell you, is a thin place, a location where the boundary between life and death is permeable, where the voices of the drowned can reach across that boundary and sink their hooks into the living. But there is one legend that unifies all the Great Lakes, one belief that transcends the individual monsters and spirits of each lake, and it is perhaps the most terrifying of all. It is the legend of the Underwater Panthers Council, and it touches upon a cosmological understanding that makes humans seem very small and very vulnerable indeed. The tribes around the Great Lakes, while they each had their own specific beliefs and stories, shared certain fundamental ideas about the nature of reality and the forces that governed it. One of these shared beliefs was that the underwater realm was not merely a physical space beneath the surface of the lakes, but a parallel world, a dimension inhabited by powerful spirits who watched and judged the actions of humans. At the heart of this underwater realm, in the deepest trenches where no light penetrates and the pressure would crush any living thing, there exists a place of gathering. The Underwater Panthers Council, sometimes called the Assembly of the Deep, where the most powerful water spirits meet to determine the fates of those who use the lakes. These spirits, led by the great water panthers like Mishapezheu, but including storm demons, serpent spirits, and entities for which there are no names in human languages, convene regularly to discuss the balance between the human world and their own domain. They observe what happens on the surface. They count the fish taken. They note the disrespect shown. They watch for those who spill blood in the water, or dump waste or fail to make proper offerings, and they render judgment. When the council decides that humans have overstepped, that the balance has been tipped too far, they act. They send storms that destroy entire fleets. They withdraw the fish, leaving humans to starve through winter. They claim specific individuals, marking them for drowning regardless of their skill or caution. This judgment is not capricious or random. It is deliberate, calculated, the enforcement of laws that humans barely understand and rarely respect. But the most chilling aspect of the council is its patience. The spirits think in terms of generations, of centuries. A wrong committed today might not be punished until your children's children are old. A debt accrued by a village might be collected decades after everyone who lived in that village has died. Time, in the underwater realm, flows differently. The spirits can afford to wait. They can afford to watch. And when they do finally act, the connection between crime and punishment may be so distant that humans do not even recognize it as justice, only as random tragedy. The legends say that the council sometimes communicates with humans through dreams and visions, sending messages to medicine men and women who have proven themselves sensitive to the spirit world. These communications are never direct. They come as symbols, as fragmentary images, as feelings that must be interpreted. A medicine man might dream of black water and wailing winds and wake, knowing that a great storm is being prepared by the council, that it will strike in a specific place at a specific time, and that the only way to avoid it is to make immediate and substantial offerings. These warnings were taken with ultimate seriousness. Entire communities would gather to discuss a medicine person's dream. They would pool their resources to create offerings of sufficient value, tobacco and copper and furs and crafted items. They would perform ceremonies that lasted days, chanting and dancing, pleading with the council to show mercy, to accept the offerings, to withdraw the judgment. Sometimes it worked. The storm would veer away, striking some other location or dissipating entirely. The marked individual would survive their next journey on the water. The fish would return after a period of absence. These were signs that the council had been satisfied, that the balance had been restored. But sometimes it did not work. Sometimes the offerings were insufficient or too late. Sometimes the offense had been so great that no amount of pleading could turn aside the punishment. And then the prophecy would unfold exactly as foreseen, and all the survivors could do was accept that they had been judged and found wanting by powers beyond their ability to comprehend, let alone challenge. The existence of the Underwater Panthers Council meant that every action on the Great Lakes had potential consequences far beyond the immediate. Spilling the blood of a deer in a canoe, something done thoughtlessly, could be noted by the council and held against you. Urinating in the lake, a natural necessity on long journeys, required an apology spoken aloud to avoid offense. Even thoughts could matter, arrogant thoughts about conquering nature or dominating the water, because some believed the spirits could sense these attitudes and would react to them. This created a culture of constant vigilance and respect around the lakes. People did not simply use the water, they negotiated with it. They approached every journey as a supplicant, not a master. They understood themselves to be guests in a realm controlled by entities whose power was absolute and whose mercy was never guaranteed. And this brings us to perhaps the most important question. Do these spirits still exist? Does the Underwater Panthers Council still meet in the darkness below? Are humans still being judged by the old standards? The native peoples who maintain the old ways would say, yes, absolutely, and without question. They would point to the continued disappearances, the inexplicable storms, the strange phenomena that occur on the Great Lakes. They would tell you that the spirits have not gone anywhere, that they remain as powerful as they ever were. The only thing that has changed is that modern humans have stopped paying attention, stopped making offerings, stopped showing respect. And this willful ignorance, this arrogance, is accumulating as a debt. The council is patient, but it is also just. And there will come a time, perhaps soon, when the accumulated offenses of the modern age will be answered. The payment will be extracted. And those who scoffed at the old legends will understand, too late, that they were never alone on these waters. But there is one more category of legend we must explore before we can understand the full scope of native beliefs about the Great Lakes. We must talk about the Wendigo, the winter demon, the creature of starvation and cannibalism that haunts the frozen shores when the lakes themselves turn to ice. The Wendigo legend is found among the Algonquian peoples, including the Ojibwe, the Cree, and others who lived in the northern reaches where winter was long and brutal. It is a legend born of the harshest conditions imaginable, of months when the sun barely rises, when game disappears, when stored food runs out, and when the choice becomes starve or do the unthinkable. The Wendigo begins as a human, a person driven mad by hunger, by the cold, by the endless winter. They have exhausted all other options. They have eaten everything, bark, leather, even boiled shoes. And finally, when death seems certain, they make the terrible choice. They consume human flesh. Sometimes it is the flesh of someone already dead, a family member who succumbed to starvation. Sometimes it is worse, an act of murder driven by desperate hunger. But the moment human flesh passes the lips, something happens. A transformation begins that is both physical and spiritual. The person's heart, some legends say, literally turns to ice. Their humanity begins to drain away, replaced by an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. They crave flesh, human flesh specifically, and the more they consume, the more they need. The hunger grows with every meal until it becomes the only thing they are, an endless, aching void. Physically, the Wendigo changes. They grow taller, much taller, 10 feet, 15 feet, towering over normal humans. But despite eating constantly, they become emaciated, skeletal, their skin pulled tight over bones, their joints swollen and distorted. Their lips are often described as tattered or missing, torn away by the frostbite of the far north or by their own teeth in their feeding frenzy. Their eyes change, losing all color, becoming white or pale gray, reflecting no light, no soul. But the most disturbing feature of the Wendigo is its silence. Despite their size, despite their emaciated condition, They move through snow and forest without making a sound. No footsteps, no breathing. They appear suddenly, stepping from behind trees or out of blizzards, and by the time you see them, it is too late to run. The Wendigo hunts primarily in winter, when the Great Lakes freeze and the world becomes a realm of ice and snow. They haunt the shorelines, the frozen expanses where fishing villages cluster, where food is scarce and desperation is high. They can smell starvation, can sense when a person is close to breaking, close to making the same choice the Wendigo once made, and they are drawn to that desperation like wolves to blood. Some legends say the Wendigo actively tries to drive people to cannibalism, that it will call out in the voice of a loved one, luring someone away from safety and into the storm, then vanishing and leaving them lost and freezing, pushing them toward the point where they too will transform. Other versions say the Wendigo simply kills and eats, but that anyone who sees a Wendigo and survives becomes infected with its hunger, begins the slow transformation themselves. The tribes develop specific methods for dealing with Wendigo attacks and Wendigo possession. If someone showed signs of transformation, if they began to exhibit the classic symptoms, talking constantly about eating human flesh, growing increasingly aggressive and irrational, their eyes taking on a vacant, hungry stare, action had to be taken immediately. Medicine men would attempt healing ceremonies, trying to warm the frozen heart, to drive out the Wendigo spirit before it fully took hold. But if these ceremonies failed, if the person was too far gone, the only solution was death. And not just death. The body had to be completely destroyed, dismembered, and burned, the ashes scattered so that the Wendigo could not reform. This was the only way to ensure the entity was truly ended. Sometimes a fully transformed Wendigo had to be hunted. Warriors would track the creature through snow and ice, following the trail of half-eaten bodies and terrorized villages. Killing a Wendigo was extraordinarily difficult. They were fast despite their size, strong beyond human measure, and seemed to feel no pain. Arrows and spears would pierce their flesh with no apparent effect. Only fire or extreme cold, ironically, could harm them. Some stories tell of Wendigos being lured onto thin ice, falling through into the freezing water below, which somehow was cold enough to shock even their frozen hearts and immobilize them. The Wendigo legend served multiple functions in tribal society. On one level, it was a warning against cannibalism, a cultural taboo reinforced by the threat of transformation into a monster. On another level, it was an explanation for the madness that sometimes overtook people during brutal winters, a way of understanding extreme behavior through a spiritual framework. And on yet another level, it was simply the acknowledgement that winter itself was a kind of monster, that the season could drive people to unthinkable acts, could strip away civilization and reveal the desperate, hungry animal beneath. But there is more to the Wendigo's connection to the Great Lakes than simply proximity. The Wendigo, according to some versions of the legend, does not simply hunt near the lakes. It enters the frozen water. When the Great Lakes ice over, when the waves stop and the entire vast surface becomes a sheet of white, the Wendigo can walk across them, crossing distances that would take humans days or weeks. And beneath that ice, in the cold black water, the Wendigo is said to be at home, more comfortable than anywhere else. Some stories describe the Wendigo diving through holes in the ice and swimming in the freezing water, moving beneath the surface until it finds a fishing party, then bursting up through the ice to attack. Other versions say that the spirit of the Wendigo actually resides in the deepest, coldest parts of the lakes, and that the creatures seen on land are merely physical manifestations, shells animated by that central, eternal spirit of hunger and cold. This connection makes a certain terrible sense. The Great Lakes in winter are another world. The water that was blue and alive in summer becomes solid, silent, and white. The lakes that defined the boundaries of tribal territories, that provided transportation and food, become barriers, vast frozen plains that are dangerous to cross and nearly impossible to survive if you fall through. The transformation from life-giving water to deadly ice mirrors the transformation of human to Wendigo, a corruption of something natural into something monstrous. And the timing of Wendigo attacks, primarily in late winter when food stores are lowest and desperation is highest, corresponds to the time when the ice is thickest, when the lakes are most completely in their frozen state. It is as if the Wendigo and the winter lake are aspects of the same force, both expressions of hunger, cold, and death. Even today, even now, reports continue. Hikers in the northern forests around the Great Lakes describe seeing figures that do not match any known animal. Impossibly tall, moving between trees with unnatural grace, there and then gone. Hunters speak of finding kills that do not match the pattern of wolves or bears, bodies torn apart with a violence that suggests rage as much as hunger, partially eaten and then abandoned. And there are the missing persons cases, people who vanish during winter camping trips or solo hikes, their tracks leading into remote areas and simply ending. No body ever recovered, no explanation ever found. The native peoples would tell you these are Wendigo attacks. They would tell you the creature still hunts, still transforms the desperate, still serves as winter's avatar. They would advise you never to camp alone near the Great Lakes in winter, never to let hunger drive you to desperate thoughts, and never, ever to answer if you hear your name called from the darkness of a winter forest. Now we must address the question that underlies all of these legends, all of these spirits and monsters and cosmic horrors. Why? Why did the native peoples of the Great Lakes develop such elaborate, terrifying mythologies around these bodies of water? What purpose did these legends serve? The answer is both simple and profound. The Great Lakes are genuinely dangerous. They are not called inland seas as a poetic exaggeration. These are massive, powerful bodies of water that create their own weather, that can and do kill experienced sailors and swimmers, that contain depths we still have not fully explored. The waves on the Great Lakes can reach heights of over 20 feet during storms. The water temperature, even in summer, rarely exceeds 60 degrees Fahrenheit in the deeper areas, cold enough to incapacitate a swimmer in minutes and kill them in less than an hour. The currents and undertows are complex and powerful, capable of pulling people away from shore faster than they can swim against them. For peoples whose survival depended on the lakes, who used them for food, transportation, and water, but who also lived at the mercy of their power, creating a mythological framework that encouraged respect and caution was not superstition. It was survival strategy. By teaching that Mishapezheu would drag you down if you disrespected the water, elders ensured that young warriors approached the lake with appropriate caution. By insisting on offerings before journeys, they built in a moment of reflection, a pause to assess weather and conditions before committing to a crossing. By marking certain areas as forbidden, they protected their people from places where currents or underwater hazards made accidents more likely. The legends also provided a way to process trauma and loss. When someone drowned, when a hunting party failed to return, when a village was destroyed by a storm, the survivors needed to understand why. The legends gave them that understanding. It was not random, it was not meaningless. The spirits had acted. Perhaps an offering had been insufficient. Perhaps a taboo had been violated. Perhaps the council had rendered judgment. This framework allowed for grief while maintaining social cohesion. It prevented the paralysis of meaningless tragedy by inserting purpose and structure. But to say the legends were merely practical, merely psychological tools, is to miss something deeper. The peoples who lived around the Great Lakes for thousands of years before European contact developed an intimate relationship with these waters. They observed patterns that modern science has only recently confirmed. They understood the complexity and the danger in ways that went beyond simple fear. And their legends reflect a sophisticated cosmology, a worldview that saw the natural world as alive, conscious, and interactive with humanity. When an Ojibwe elder spoke of Mishapezheu, they were not simply telling a scary story. They were articulating a relationship with Lake Superior, describing its moods and its power in the language of spirit and myth. When a medicine man warned of the storm demons of Lake Erie, he was expressing meteorological knowledge encoded in narrative form. And when the tribes gathered to make offerings to the Underwater Panthers Council, they were engaging in a ritual that reinforced community bonds, environmental awareness, and a humility that modern society often lacks. The legends remind us that we are not separate from nature, not above it, not immune to its forces. They remind us that these waters have depth beyond our comprehension, power beyond our control, and a history that extends far past human memory. They remind us to be careful, to be respectful, and to remember that we share this world with forces that do not necessarily have our best interests at heart. And perhaps most importantly, the legends remain relevant. Every year, people drown in the Great Lakes. Every year, boats capsize and swimmers vanish, and storms arise with deadly speed. The statistics are sobering. The Great Lakes, all 5 of them together, have claimed an estimated 30,000 lives since record-keeping began, and that number only includes documented deaths. The actual toll is certainly higher. The native peoples who still live around the Great Lakes, who maintain their traditional practices and beliefs, continue to make offerings. They continue to teach their children about the spirits. They continue to mark certain places as dangerous or forbidden, and they watch with a mixture of sadness and resignation as others, lacking this knowledge, lacking this respect, venture onto the lakes unprepared and sometimes pay the ultimate price. The legends of the Great Lakes are not merely historical curiosities or entertaining folklore. They are living traditions, warnings passed down through generations, wisdom encoded in story. They are the collective memory of peoples who learned, through hard experience and careful observation, how to coexist with some of the most powerful and dangerous bodies of water on the planet. When you stand on the shore of Lake Superior and look out at the vast expanse of water stretching to the horizon, when you feel the wind coming off Lake Michigan in winter, when you see the strange fogs that form on Lake Ontario or hear the waves crashing against the Erie shoreline, when you experience the peculiar silence of Lake Huron on a calm day, remember that you are not the first to stand there. Remember that for thousands of years, people have looked at these same waters and seen not just H2O and geology, but something more, something alive, something that watches and remembers and judges. Remember the water panthers prowling the depths, their copper scales gleaming in the darkness, their eyes scanning the surface for the disrespectful and the careless. Remember the sleeping giant turning in its slumber beneath Lake Michigan, waiting for the day when it will finally wake and reclaim its domain. Remember the storm demons of Lake Erie, eternally angry, eternally hunting. Remember the meteor dragon trailing fire beneath Lake Ontario's waves. Remember the singing stones and the voices of the drowned calling from Lake Huron's islands. Remember the Wendigo walking across the winter ice, tall and silent, and eternally hungry. Remember the Underwater Panthers Council meeting in the deepest trenches, discussing your fate and the fates of all who use their waters. Remember the ceremonies and offerings and taboos that protected generations of people who came before you. And remember that the lakes themselves have not changed. Their power remains, their depth remains, their danger remains. What has changed is that we, modern humans, have forgotten the old wisdom. We have convinced ourselves that technology and science make us immune to the forces that our ancestors respected and feared. We have stopped making offerings. We have stopped showing respect. We have forgotten that we are guests here, temporary visitors in a realm that belongs to powers far older and far greater than ourselves. The spirits do not care about your boat's horsepower, or your GPS, or your weather apps. They do not care about your confidence or your experience. They care only about respect, about balance, about whether you remember your place in the order of things. And if you have forgotten, if you approach these waters with arrogance or carelessness, then the spirits will remind you. Not because they are evil, not because they hate humans, but simply because that is their nature, their function, their purpose. The Great Lakes are beautiful. They are majestic. They are essential to the ecology and economy of the entire region. But they are also dangerous, mysterious, and according to the traditions of the peoples who know them best, inhabited by spirits that have not gone away and will not be ignored. So when you next visit one of these inland seas, take a moment, stand on the shore, look out at the water, and perhaps, just perhaps, take a pinch of tobacco and throw it into the waves. Whisper a prayer, or simply a request for safe passage. Acknowledge that you are not alone, that beneath the surface, in the depths where no light reaches, something ancient and powerful exists. It costs nothing to show respect. It costs nothing to remember the old ways. But the price of forgetting, the legends tell us, can be everything. The water is watching. The spirits are listening. And the legends, born of blood and drowning and terror and wisdom accumulated over millennia, continue to speak their truth to anyone willing to hear. These are the horrifying legends of the Great Lakes. These are the warnings. These are the truths that the native peoples learned through generations of living alongside these powerful waters. Dismiss them as primitive superstition if you wish. Explain them away as natural phenomena misunderstood by pre-scientific cultures. Rationalize them however you need to, but when you are on the water and the wind suddenly shifts, when you see something moving beneath your boat that is too large to be a fish, when you hear voices calling from the fog, when the surface suddenly goes dead, calm in a way that raises the hair on your neck, when you feel watched by something you cannot see, remember these stories. Remember Mishapezhe and the storm demons, and Gasiandietha and the singing stones, and the Wendigo and the council waiting in the depths. Remember that for thousands of years, people knew these things were real, knew they had to be respected, knew the price of forgetting. The Great Lakes remember, the spirits remember, and they are patient, so patient, waiting for the next one who forgets, who grows careless, who believes that ancient warnings do not apply to them. Will that be you? Or will you show respect, make your offerings, and remember that these waters have been here far longer than you have, and will be here long after you are gone? The choice is yours. But the legends remain, unchanging and eternal, written in water and blood and the bones of those who learned too late that some stories are not just stories. The waves lap at the shore, the fog rolls in, and beneath the surface, in the cold and the dark, something stirs and watches and waits. This is the truth of the Great Lakes, according to those who knew them first and best. This is the wisdom encoded in legend. This is the warning. Will you heed it?